Welcome to another wonderful live in-person Futurist New Deal discussion, and a little bit of a continuation of our last discussion. David and myself, this is David Shumaker.
Hello.
I'm Johan Ben Zion. And you guys know us. You've seen our talks in the past. We talked quite recently about the history of transhumanism, and I think that's a pretty good segue because we're going to talk today about the Transhumanist Handbook and the companion piece that the Arizona Transhumanist Party is producing, a video companion piece that includes a short introduction to the author's works, each individual chapter, 1 to 3 minutes generally, describing what the author had written about, what their message was, anything else that they wanted to convey in that time. And we have quite a few of these already finished. About a third of the total participants, contributors to this book, have also done this companion piece. So we're moving towards maybe getting that out within the next few weeks. And we want to talk about some of these people. I'm excited. My friend Natasha Vitamore, we are meeting on Thursday to talk about her chapter, also titled The History of Transhumanism. And I think that's a pretty good a starting point for us to be talking, David. We were just talking.
I would agree.
Go, please.
Yeah, well, starting with Natasha's chapter in the book on history, I found it really interesting that I've been involved with humanism or transhumanism here in recent years, but then to go back and see what a rich legacy we have coming down from people that were exploring these things long before modern science was making the kind of progress and offering potentially the kind of hopes that it is now. The idea of transhumanism, radical life extension, and the many things that follow from that has been part of the human psyche for centuries, not just decades, but centuries. It's really fortunate, I think, for us that are living here in the first part of the 21st century to see so much of what other people have dreamt about, written about, encouraged discussion on, now finally coming to a stage where radical life extension may be closer than you think. I've heard that someplace.
Seems like it could be a slogan of some kind.
Perhaps it is.
Yes. And to get to that stage in history, we have had humans as a tool-making species, a technology-developing species for many hundreds and thousands of years, and that background is addressed in Natasha's chapter, as well as more recent developments.
One thing that the book brought out, and I think maybe I heard a little bit of it in conversations over the weekend that we were in California for the book signing, was it's not just the innovations that are going on now that we label transhumanism that change the human environment, that even change our bodies for that matter. As I'm reading and I realize that something as ancient as domesticating fire and being able to warm ourselves and to cook food, cooking the food changed the whole nature of how we eat and how we can store things. Cooked food can potentially last longer than raw food. It takes fewer human calories to chew and digest cooked food than it does raw food, allowing us to get more nutrients out of it. And essentially, fire allowed us to be able to extract many more calories from the food and put them to good use, which literally made physical changes to our bodies. So it's not just the type of things that we're talking about now making those kind of changes, but it's always been that way. And I think if you follow any of the major changes, for example, what happened during the Industrial Revolution and how did that change how people related to how they worked, where they lived, what did that do, with their physical bodies? And then something that, as a technologist, I became very familiar with, which was computer age, and what that has brought on, and how that has changed us.
And that's where we start to see more than imperceptible changes in techno progress. Maybe we don't know quite where we are. We might be here. We might be here. We might be here. But we do know that we can track that a little more because of the existence of computing and systems of this kind. Yes, so that's there's so many different contributors to this work. It's a great many computer scientists, a great many thinkers along these lines, other technologists, a great many medical professionals and minds that have, and I've been lucky enough to speak to a number of them as well, and of course none of this is possible without the editor, Newton Lee, the chair of the California Transhumanist Party, and the organizer, the key organizer of the event that we attended, that we mentioned, a longevity seminar in Burbank the weekend before last. And that was, we have to thank him for bringing all of these people together. It's quite an effort, and it's quite an accomplishment as well. It brings to mind our relationship to the U.S. Transhumanist Party. It's also a diverse group.
Absolutely.
But we all do have these common core values, and even though we do have some differences of opinion from time to time, we are all fundamentally life extensionists. We are all fundamentally techno-progressives, and so we're able to be working together in those ways. And I said this to another candidate, Mr. Harris, just a few days ago. None of us has a crystal ball. I might be a little bit more on the anarcho-syndicalist end of the spectrum. He might be a little bit more on the anarcho-capitalist end of the spectrum. I do find many anarcho-capitalist initiatives to be very valuable, but nobody has a crystal ball. No one knows which of those things is going to work. The best ideology is the one that works.
That's right.
And
which is why we need such a breadth of ideas. When we say that the U.S. Transhumanist Party, the authors of this book cover such a broad area, all of them very passionate about their particular area. I would say that each one of the candidates in the current election are very passionate about the things that they focus on. And that's not driving things to be separate, in my view. What that does is that makes sure that we cast as wide a net as possible, to your point about nobody has a crystal ball. So what is going to bring radical life extension? What is going to bring radical prosperity, radical health, things of this nature? We need every one of those viewpoints. There are 60-some authors in this book, each one with perhaps some overlap to another, but all with their own distinct flavor and point of view. We need each and every one of that, and we need exactly those kind of things in the U.S. Transhumanist Party brought out freely and discussed freely, and I think that's the point that you were making.
I just shared a conversation with David Wood. It was shared to Watch Party in the Futurist New Deal group. Quite a number of people, I think, participated and enjoyed that. A good number, and a good number of people have already seen that. But we're lucky to have these kind of minds contributing to these conversations. And I'm uploading right now the conversation with another contributor to this work, Ira Pastor, and my lord. Talking to Ira Pastor, it almost feels like talking to a time traveler from the future who has specific insights into life extension that we do not possess.
That's amazing.
He really. There's not too many people who have the breadth of understanding of all of these related disciplines that he does, and have been in the trenches working on those things in the way in the way that he has. That's a short list of people that have that level of knowledge, and his. I really recommend reading that chapter. I recommend reading certainly Liz Parrish's chapter, and all of these. You don't have to read them in order. You should read them all. But certainly these people who are have insights into, because the life extension is, I think, the chief organizing principle of our community.
I believe so. It's a core tenet of the U.S. Transhumanist Party.
It's number one on that list.
That's right.
I was also talking about a young gentleman who contributed in some ways to this book, a gentleman named David Aguilar.
Tremendous presentation.
Yes, he had a presentation via satellite and video for us at the seminar. He was in Spain. He was working on his Netflix film in Madrid, I believe, and so he wasn't able to join us in person. But we were all quite impacted by his presentation, nonetheless. And I thought I might as well also announce this. My running partner and I, Kimberly Forsyth, we are starting a charitable undertaking, a crowdfunding in conjunction with Mr. Aguilar. Mr. Aguilar, we may not be aware, he has built a prosthetic. Using commonplace robotics parts and Lego parts, essentially, from robotics kits. I used to be a robotics coach, so I have some familiarity with what he was doing. I'm pretty astonished that a high school student was able to create such a thing. But he's utterly abled. He's missing a part of his arm, and he built a prosthetic of his own. And because he has he's developed these prototypes. He's able to provide these low-cost prosthetics to other people who would otherwise be spending many tens of thousands of dollars on such a similar object.
From what we saw in the films, they are amazingly useful.
Yes. He has a lot of functionality from the use of these servos and motors. This is a very functional piece, and all of us were very moved at this presentation. I was telling Kim about this, and she said, let's start a crowd fund. Let's raise some money for this good cause to get this prosthetic to these young people who some of them might be on waiting lists for a more expensive prosthetic. They could be using this now. Some of them might have different conditions. But we think it's a really wonderful thing to be doing, and also it might just as we have this companion piece, it ties into the things that we were all working on. So we're very excited about that. I'm pleased to announce that.
I think that really goes to capturing the spirit of transhumanism. Somebody taking into their own hands what they had available, and then making something and proving the point of concept, bringing other people in and letting them see what's going on, which then has produced this crowdfunding piece that you and Kimberly are going to do. This is the kind of, when we say techno-optimist, I think this really brings that out. It's showing that not only do we applaud somebody for doing something like that, but we are also moving this forward.
Yes, and this young gentleman, he's a model of a citizen engineer, citizen scientist, and it's very gratifying to be able to see what he's doing. And even though Kim and I couldn't on our own develop such a thing, even just being able to raise awareness for what he has done and make some small contribution to getting this useful thing. And as you said, it becomes a larger collaboration.
Yes.
That is very much in the spirit of citizen science and techno-optimism as well. You and I, we enjoyed talking with Joe Bardeen
Indeed.
The communications director of Radfest.
Yes, and People Unlimited.
Yes, and People Unlimited, and a wonderful man. We met him. We met up with him at this seminar also, and I was lucky enough to interview him about his chapter, Drinking from the Air, and he really inspired me, and I think he inspired you in that talk.
Well, absolutely.
We can talk about the role of the citizen engineer and citizen scientist. We can talk about the role of the life extension entrepreneur. But I think, should also talk about the role of the person who inspires people, and gets the message out about life extension and techno progress. And there's few people who are quite so good at that as Joe Bardeen. Let's talk about his chapter and about the work of Joe Bardeen and Radfest, our friends in these partner organizations. What was it about that talk and about that chapter that impressed you so?
Well, there was a couple of things. I think to start off with, it starts out very personal. At the beginning of that chapter, Joe is talking about experiences from his past and how that relates to death and how that personally impacted him. And then we switch to these tall trees, these tall redwood trees. And those are some of the longest lived trees that are around. So obviously a contrast there between, talking about death early on and then, the hope of longer life in these trees. But trees have a limiting factor in that, they must draw moisture all the way to, the top of the tree for the tree to be hydrated and to live. Well, these trees are so tall, how is that even possible? Well, these trees grow in a very moist forest near the coast and have adapted themselves over time, presumably, to be able to pull moisture in through their bark and hydrate the upper limits of the tree. So that makes a very good parallel, and I think also something that's personally inspiring for what are the kind of things that we need to do to hydrate ourselves, whether it be physical hydration or whether it be hydrating our excitement about wanting to push forward with technological progress and the things that it can do. How do we open ourselves up to those things? Having somebody like Joe that can paint that big picture, I think is really valuable, because many of us that come from a science engineering background, I'll say myself anyway, can become very, very focused on my particular area or on their particular area. And having somebody that can raise your sights and give you that encouragement to keep moving forward in a very, very personal way. Because we're talking trees, and I felt very, very personally attached, and then applied that back to myself.
And I would say Joe Bardeen, of course, works very closely with Jim Stroll, and James Stroll is also somebody who has that vantage point, being the key organizer of Radfest, speaking to so many different people, really having that lay of the land, seeing what's going on. Not becoming so laser focused on one particular subfield in these science disciplines, but being able to give us a lot of broad context there, and that is incredibly valuable. And then, of course, I've said it of these gentlemen, Joe. I said it of Joe. I said it of Jim, and all of their collaborators, that these guys had faith in life extension before I did. Yes. I mentioned to Joe that a big moment for me in believing in this was realizing that Ray Kurzweil was effectively the CTO of Google. Ray Kurzweil was somebody who had already devoted an awful lot of resources and energy to life extension, and then seeing it elevated with that enormous and influential organization, I said, wow, this could actually happen. And I was very hopeful of that before that, but Jim Stroll was not merely hopeful of that. He saw it. He saw it coming a mile away, and I can't claim that. I mean, so the same thing with people like Natasha Vitamour, all of these people.
Someone else that's been in it for a very long time has been able to see it early and take action. Both of them taking action very early on.
Yes. You don't start to build these kind of organizations. You don't build an organization like Humanity Plus. You don't start an event like Radfest unless you have an awful lot of insights into this community and working knowledge and initiative to be really doing that work, like you said.
Well, and it's not an easy thing, I'm sure. I mean, we talked earlier about how diverse the transhumanist community is and why that's good. Well, Radfest is exactly like that as well. It has people that come to radical life extension from so many different viewpoints. Now, that's great. I mean, I absolutely love that. I'm a bridge builder myself. However, it takes somebody that can take all those different viewpoints, get them all in the same building at the same time, talking about their own particular passions and getting everybody to play well together, realizing that that makes the movement and each one of us that are in the movement much, much stronger than we would be otherwise.
And I'm reminded of this conversation also with Joe Bardeen, where we were talking about the need for inspiring people, as he does, the need for a specific kind of messaging to enhance the pace of techno progress. So the more people that become involved in this, as scientists, as citizen scientists, as life extension advocates and believers, the sooner we can hope to see some of these outcomes, like a longevity, escape velocity. On the flip side of that, it came up in the Joe Bardeen conversation, was someone like Michael Rose, who presented at this seminar.
He did.
And he had a very insightful presentation, and he was talking about a lot of the nuances of ending cell death and it not being a simple equation, and that we have to consider these complexities as well. So it's kind of a little bit more straight talk. But we need all of that, and somebody like Jim Stroll, in that very case, was bringing those people together and doing that for Radfest. That's coming up in just a month. You can still get tickets for that, folks.
Yes, it's well worth going to. I've been to the last three, and I'm not going to miss this one either.
Yes, nor will I.
But going back to talking about that diversity of opinion that Dr. Rose brought. Once again, that helps, I think, keep us from becoming myopic, from focusing in on just a few things, and reminds us that there can be a bigger picture out there. I don't see that as negative. I don't see that as detrimental in any way. If anything else, it keeps our focus nice and wide, which doesn't stop us from tightening focus specifically when we come across things that need that, but we also need to remember to maintain that wide focus as we move forward.
And we've talked about people who have worked in research and development, and people who've worked in the life sciences as entrepreneurs, doing all of this kind of work. Also talking about people who are presenters on these subjects and organizers on these subjects. I don't think anybody that immediately comes to mind encompasses all of those skills quite so well as Jose Cordero.
Yes.
who I was lucky enough to interview, and who is a real source of inspiration, I think, to me.
Viva la revolution.
Yes. And this life extension revolution, this revolution against aging and death. This is a worthy undertaking, and it's a worthy message. And it's a worthy scientific endeavor as well. And I was so pleased to meet Jose and learn a little bit more about the areas that he sees us moving into, and really fascinating discussion. You and I prepped another talk about data for all, and
yes.
We're going to do that one very soon. Specifically, the data for all initiatives that are being planned with mini satellites that have been launched by a few large concerns, the Musk organization,
Yes.
Amazon, and also Google, all putting these mini satellites up that can beam Wi-Fi to everyone for a much lower cost and a very high degree of reliability. There's also these similar satellite arrays, solar arrays, can be providing solar energy that can be beamed to Earth. That's not quite as close coming down the pipeline as Data for All, but that is one of many areas that Jose also takes an interest in. Jose is often has another catchphrase besides "Viva la Revolution," which is energy.
Energy. That's right.
And that's maybe a figurative usage to some degree, but it's also a reference to an energy singularity. This idea that free and low cost energy becoming so commonplace will dramatically restructure our society, move us ever more quickly into a truly post-industrial civilization, and that can be coming from a lot of areas, not limited to solar arrays in near Earth orbit. Fascinating subject. We had a young man who moved us a little bit in the course of this weekend to think about existential risks. I'm thinking of Daniel Yeluishvili's presentation on geoengineering.
Yes.
And he also has a chapter of a similar title in the book. I suggest you read that. I suggest you also maybe watch the Futurist New Deal podcast interview that I did with him. That is available online as well. This is our most pressing of existential risks. Concerns around climate, and this young man has a lot of specific ideas for interventions for geoengineering. And as much as we want to remain optimistic about technology, it has been a double-edged sword. We have used in earlier industrial technologies and 20th century technologies in a somewhat irresponsible way, and we have to have bioremediation and geoengineering initiatives to fix some of that and to stave off future concerns. And so we have to be considering all of these ideas. All of these things are a part of transhumanist philosophy and concerns.
I would say that transhumanist philosophy that at play here is the fact that we are not, a victim to something even like global warming. The techno-positive viewpoint on this is that yes, certain things have happened based on perhaps maybe limited understanding of technology, but as our understanding grows, we can grow with that. And as you said, this is not something that's new. I mean, you go all the way back to one of those really great early inventions like fire. Fire is wonderful, keeps you warm at night, cooks your food. If you're not careful with it, it'll burn your house down. So there's good that can come, but it's us who decide how to maximize the good and minimize what the other effects are. And as we learn more, as we've done with fire or any technology that's come forward, then we make corrections and we move on. So that's one of the things that I really enjoyed listening to his particular talk that weekend, talking about carbon capture and how that works and what the different possibilities are. It takes you out of the, gee, this is bad, I don't know what we should do, to, gee, this could be bad and we can make it better, and we can continue to make it better. And we can do that with everything. Each one of the individual chapters that's in the book that's talking about some type of technology could potentially have a downside. It's up to us to recognize those things and to be able to move forward to create the maximum benefit for humankind. That's really what transhumanism is all about, is transcending the limitations that we have as humans and continuing to grow those benefits for everybody. I love your tie-in with Internet for All, and we'll come back to talking about all those internet satellites in space at some point. But I look at that and I think, well, gee, you know, I've got internet wherever I go. That's not a problem for me. But what if I lived out in the African Sahara or some distant place? Those kind of satellites essentially gives everybody, wherever you grow up, for the cost of a cell phone, the ability to be able to communicate anywhere and to share ideas. And who knows where the next Albert Einstein, or pick some famous person from literature or some famous person from government or whatever that might be, where do these people come from? And would we have missed them if they didn't have a vehicle to be able to tie into this global grid of information?
And I believe that kind of access to literature and literacy, that I believe is basically synonymous with this notion of data for all. That is the catalyst for many Einsteins. It's the Einstein doing the sort of work that he does, or pick the scientist of choice doing the sort of work that they do. That may be a feature of unique qualities that they have, but a person with incredibly unique qualities, the feral child, living in the woods, has no accomplishments of this kind. This is a feature of having access, and there's no greater mechanism, as you mentioned, for access than something like free or very low cost Wi-Fi for everyone on Earth.
And where it goes exponential, I believe, is how many of those are out there, and then what kind of collaborative efforts with modern tools and so forth. I think that is a bit like the singularity in itself. I can't see past having that type of collaboration with so many minds, and just taking the percentage of how many of those would be truly incredible. What kind of incredible things will grow out of that, and then from there, where do we go?
Yes, and it's it came up in this conversation with David Wood that a transhumanist is not a religion.
No.
But yeah, we do have these core values and beliefs that hold us together, and that is something that we place a lot of stock in. And a moment ago I was speaking of Daniel Yelishvili. He's starting a faith-based transhumanist syncretic organization. I interviewed 3 other members of other faith-based syncretic organizations in the moments leading up to our weekend excursion, and those were Lincoln Cannon of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, Blair Osler, also of the Mormon Transhumanist Association and Christian Transhumanist Association, and of course Micah Redding of the Christian Transhumanist Association. These people are all founders or organizers in these institutions, and these are people who have these values of life extension, of techno progress, of embracing the future that we speak of, but also bringing that message to people in their community, and trying to again be building bridges and making those kind of connections. I was lucky enough also to speak to all of them, and a Buddhist techno optimist, a gentleman named John Lewis, on a panel discussion about syncretic and faith-based syncretic transhumanist ideas with on the Detonation program with Steel Archer, and it was a wonderful talk. And also got their chapter outlines, because those 3 are also contributors to this book that we're discussing. Really moving and powerful stuff to be able to get these differing ideas and opinions from people but seeing their dedication to life extension and similar ideas.
Yeah, very much so. I keep going back to thinking about the diversity that was in that room, the diversity that's in the book, the diversity in things like Radfist. Diversity is a word that gets kicked around a lot. I think in the Transhumanist Party, it is extremely fundamental. We can come at this from a religious viewpoint. We can come at this from a secular viewpoint. We can come at this from a politically left or right viewpoint. It's all good.
Yes.
If we could get the rest of the world to operate as with accepting that much diversity and picking what works and moving forward, maybe that's a major thing that transhumanism can bring to the rest of the world.
And I do believe that it's already being done. You know, we mentioned this demonstration from about 2 years ago from the Google Labs and the Google Assistant, which is now the name of something that I use today, something you probably use today. But this demonstration was particularly this digital assistant that's able to make phone calls, that's able to do a certain degree of useful work product beyond what the digital assistants are doing in other contexts. And what that is basically a free front end of a business for every person on Earth.
Wow.
Being able to more easily run a small business, being able to more easily run a sole proprietorship. This is when we think of, we mentioned in existential risks, I don't think of advanced algorithms as chiefly as an existential risk. I think of it as a great boon in this creation of new work product, in this creation of enabling people to be able to do things in the marketplace and in their personal lives that they were not able to do quite nearly so easily in earlier times. But we do also have to think of some of these existential concerns. You mentioned the fire being a great tool, and also
That's right.
and also a risky thing. We have things, but if a fire burns on the African savannas in a small isolated community, the people leave that immediate danger. We have technologies now that are a lot bigger than that, a lot potentially creating more damage than that. So it's why we have to be having all of these kinds of conversations, vetting these notions, trying to anticipate these concerns, and so that we are not people who are caught unawares by a spreading wildfire in the form of some existential risk.
And hopefully we're spreading, good, solid knowledge about these subjects. Many times I think, whether it be Hollywood or television shows or whatever, they make great drama out of things like artificial intelligence or other such things. And while that makes for really good ratings and really good shows, I think it's up to the people that are working in these areas, as we've seen in this book, coming out and talking about. So what is narrow AI like? What are expert systems like? How does that play to advanced general intelligence? And putting the real facts that are out there, having discussions about them molding the ethics of the future beyond these things. As we come up, for example, with mind interfaces that would allow us to tie directly into AI and into vast storage systems. These are the place to have these discussions. Movies and so forth can be very entertaining. I enjoy going to them as well. And perhaps, books like the Transhumanist Handbook, they get out there and provide perhaps a more balanced viewpoint and talk about how things really are versus the cinematic versions. Very, very beneficial.
Yes, and there's again, I think it does bear repeating that we don't. I don't think we have such great risks in advanced algorithms. I think that we have mostly promise, and even in the life sciences, we have mostly promise for ending human misery and extending lifespans and having a greater quality of life and new experiences beyond. But we do have to, it is a package deal. The same thing that allows those things to be happening also allows, this came up in the conversation with David Wood. He mentioned the notion that Eliezer Yudkowsky had popularized, which is basically with every passing year, as technology advances, the IQ points required for a mad scientist to destroy the Earth becomes lower and lower. So a biolab in the 20th century was a $100 million affair, the sole province of nation states. Today, in the post-CRISPR era, a biolab that has potentially very equally destructive capacities is something that would be something that any grad student in the life sciences could conceivably run in their garage, and it creates a possibility for blundering into making some mistakes of this kind that could have very upsetting consequences. It creates a possibility for bad actors to be doing things that we don't want them to do, so all of this kind of it advances in tandem, and we have to consider it, and we have to allow for a certain kind of approach to this.
What makes you optimistic based on what you've just said? I find that fascinating.
Well, I mean, I do believe that we have the oversight mechanisms beginning to be in place. Mm-hmm. People are willing to be be giving up some privacy in the interest of I could know and have met many more life scientists in different disciplines, and very rarely have I heard them say that they overly resent the idea that that there would be some kind of surveillance of them, because these are dangerous things, potentially dangerous things. So we have to accept a certain kind of approach, new approaches to concepts around privacy, and this kind of leads to the panopticon society notion and the surveillance notion, the idea that we can all participate in this. We can crowdsource this effort at seeing that we don't have great damage to our world through advanced algorithms or the life sciences in this case, and we have a responsibility to discuss that as well. Yeah, no, I don't believe that we are poised to see the destruction of some ecosystem, but I think that even a small increase in that chance is something that has to be addressed, because over time that risk does grow.
When you say privacy, that brings up a couple of things. I think there's personal privacy, and then say there's professional privacy, and I think this goes to open source, for example, in the computer world, and perhaps open source in the biotechnological world as well. I think that from an open source standpoint, where somebody can see my work, somebody can see your work, we can collaborate together. I think it's harder to conceal what a bad actor would be doing, because that work's going to have to be taking place someplace else too. The platforms for being able to share the information, if they're optimized for things such as open source, it's an easy sell, perhaps, or an easier sell to say that we're going to make your individual work better, believe it or not, by sharing what your knowledge is, because you're also going to then be open and available to be able to build on what other people have done. And it goes back to the synergetic approach, that maybe the other person couldn't have built on that, but you can see something into it that they couldn't. So the idea of open source or something like that for the bioengineering world, for AI, getting out of the potentially limiting siloed, where everybody is recreating what somebody else has already done.
That's a concern. You're pretty familiar with that concern in computer science terms.
Exactly right. Why reinvent the wheel? It was a great invention.
Yeah. Well, we bumped into those gentlemen at the seminar who were working on an application.
Yes, that's right.
That would, among other things, conceivably allow for translation from natural language into any number of programming languages, potentially removing some of those concerns, and also in the nearer term, just allowing these same digital assistants to be a little bit more interrogating us, a little bit more participatory in creating work product and doing things of this kind. So those are exciting prospects. It's interesting when in talking about this open source idea, because organizations that are historically quite proprietary, quite acquisitive, when they're looking at the prospect of developing something akin to a recursive self-improving algorithm or quantum computing that is a little bit more useful, all of those kinds of things that would be a sort of game changers in computer science. Those people who were quite proprietary, those same people are now saying, we need to make sure that everybody has eyes on this, and everybody is participating in this, because to not do so could really be the more disruptive move. To have it siloed, to have it the property of one concern, is a potentially great danger, or great possible disruption to entire civilizations. So we are on the verge of having to address many of these kinds of concerns. I know this is a separate talk, but we talked about the mini satellites,
yes,
and data for all,
yes, and
you have some familiarity with some of the competing service providers who would be potentially losing out if Amazon, Google, or the Musk organizations get these mini satellites beaming data to everyone at a much lower cost. Do you think that there's a prospect for corporate espionage in slowing this transition to this beaming Wi-Fi?
Well, probably so, but I would say that's nothing new. Corporate espionage between countries that want to put forth new technologies. That's something that's been around, forever, potentially. Going back to open source, that kind of tears down some of those walls and allowing credit where credit's due. Now, I don't expect to see that perhaps sometime soon between, say, terrestrial and satellite communications. What could bring something interesting to it, though, can be where those technologies are better together than they are separate. Satellite might be great for providing, say, internet, as we talked about, out on some desolate areas of the world that don't have much infrastructure, but in places that do, that have tall buildings, things of that nature, there's plenty of shadows. There's issues getting that. For anybody that has satellite radio, I have it in my car. I love to listen to it. And you drive under a bridge, it doesn't work so well there. So I guess what I look at is, I think the thing that could, it's a big enough pie. There's this whole idea of being able to spread this seamlessly perhaps would work best with using a number of different technologies together. So you beam into a particular area, and then you have terrestrial, units that fill in the gaps, so to speak. And when you move into wider areas where you're free from those shadows, then maybe the satellite's going to be better. And it wouldn't be cost effective to put in terrestrial systems in those areas. Otherwise, they'd already be there. So it doesn't have to be an either or, I don't believe. But sure, back to your question, people are always going to want to know what the other company's doing. And perhaps that's not such a bad thing from the standpoint that maybe they come across something that they can use and bring greater opportunity in all this to all the different players.
Yeah, I think of some of the Google data services that came down the pipeline in years prior, and I remember people talking about saying that it was going to take up a larger market share than it proved to take up. And again, it does, I think, come down to a lot of these competing organizations, and some of them having tremendous influence, some of them having tremendous lobbying reach.
Well, that's true too.
So those are all big time considerations. Yes, it's really a fascinating thing to think about. Also, to think about just, I'm not somebody who disregards the need for consumer protections that being provided by our political organizations, but there are people who are really very, very much more deregulation minded in certain aspects in our organization and in this race as well. But it is wonderful to also consider that there's so many market solutions. This data for all, even if it is only used in some piecemeal ways, as you've described, it will tend to be a good thing for consumers, driving prices down, and giving more options. So we're increasingly moving into that world, and like we said, ultimately I think for any technologist, the ideology is secondary to the functionality. And so in any of these discussions, the political philosophy or organizing structure of the thing is that wins out, should be the one that works best.
Well, I think so. You talked a bit about deregulation there. That's not a static subject. I'm thinking right now that things like sales tax for things that you buy over the internet. We talked about internet commerce. Early on, there were great moves to keep sales tax down, to keep costs down as the internet was building out that structure for sales. Now we're seeing more and more states that are saying, well, you know what? I think we want that revenue. We're not getting it from the brick and mortar stores perhaps as much. And so obviously they have an incentive to want that money, but also letting something new grow, see where it goes to, be able to sustain us before adding something like that. I think there's a parallel model for regulation. Sometimes you need perhaps what some people would call the Wild West approach. Go out there and just let the different technologies go, see where they go, see which ones emerge the strongest, have the best customer appeal, see which ones, and then form what kind of regulations, if any, need to be there for that. And then, but being careful not to put a lid on new things that are constantly emerging from these technologies as they go.
And the genesis of this talking point, I suppose, for myself, around data for all was a part of the Futurist New Deal. It's one of the pillars of the Futurist New Deal that Wi-Fi and data for all is a public good, and effectively a human right. But then in writing about this for the Futurist New Deal literature and pamphlets, the ebook that we wrote, we chose to focus not on these municipal undertakings, these and nationally subsidized programs, but rather on these mini satellite initiatives, because just as I know some people who are working on apps, maybe data sharing apps or different kinds of things. If these things start booming, these mini satellites start booming, that maybe makes their app not as useful. It's the same kind of thing with building out a lot of municipal infrastructure, and then having spent a lot of money on something that's no longer entirely necessary. So I think that's a pretty good example of areas where we have to always be agile in thinking about these regulatory and deregulatory concerns. And definitely I would tend to err on the side of caution of deregulating as it relates to public health, and as it relates to things around wage concerns. But in other areas, I mean, we don't need to be erring on the side of caution quite so much. I don't suppose.
Well, it is a bit of let it go, see where it goes, and then be able to assess it logically and try to make the decisions to make it useful. It goes back to the fire argument, you know. Yes,
yeah, very much so. Yeah. Well, I understand that you're going to be on the Steel Archer show, Detonation. I'm really looking forward to getting the more comprehensive view of your insights into these network technologies that are your area of expertise in the networked world as well. So I'm really looking forward to that. That's going to be really exciting.
Well, I think so as well, and it'd be great to talk about what brought us together, which is the Arizona Transhumanist Party, and be able to grow this party as well as growing the U.S. Transhumanist Party, and being able to take some of this techno-optimism, to take some of this views of the future and what can be, and open that up to as many people as possible.
Very nice. Yes, and Steel Archer has been a wonderful friend to the United States Transhumanist Party in these many months. He has been a sounding board for all of us, many of the contributors to this primary campaign. Many of the candidates, basically all of the candidates, have gone on that program, and we need to all be also in the context of politics be thinking about these kind of media strategies and working having these good working relationships with guys like this. It's one of the main critiques of this primary is not having is not always getting the message out there as well as we might, and I'm guilty of it, and we're lucky to have Steel Archer and Detonation, and we're lucky to be able to work with these other media partners that we've developed as well.
Well, the more people we have talking about transhumanism, the more channels that we have. Steel brings a large viewing audience, so there's a good opportunity to introduce people to transhumanism that might not otherwise be able to do that. But then I also think many of the interviews that you've done talking to some of what I would describe as the big names in the transhumanist movement also tend to generate interest, because people have seen Liz Parrish, for example. She's been featured in a BBC show. So people outside of this transhumanist organization are aware of her name. And I think the more that we can try to leverage some of that, the better off we're going to be as time goes on, especially when the primaries are done and it's time to really take this, I think, full force out into the world and let people see transhumanism for what it is. And I believe that when they do, they'll be as excited about it as I am.
Yeah, and it's been small advances here and there in getting these messages out to people. But I know an awful lot of people who are supporters of Medicare for All and similar kinds of reforms, who are now starting to open up a little bit because of this primary, because of sharing these interviews and what Steel is doing, what all of us are trying to do. We are making inroads in getting these ideas out there, and it's worthwhile because just from this came up in discussions with a number of people, including Ira Pastor last night, the cost savings in these systems prevent. We have right now $7 trillion being spent basically on end-of-life care, and by shifting that, we can get a lot more bang for our buck out of a smaller cost, and that can allow us to be doing better by these many tens of millions of people who are not being as well served as they would like in public health terms, and certainly a fairly large number of people who are really falling through the cracks in a tragic way. Tens of thousands of people not getting the health care that they need, losing their insurance through this or that, and falling by the wayside. It's a tragedy, and but by shifting that focus as well, we can be doing better by them, as well as through other, I guess, more traditional approaches. So,
well, and maybe some other approaches that are actually starting to work their way into the mainstream to some extent, telemedicine, things of that nature, which allow us to not physically need to fly a doctor 300 miles to do procedures, or even day surgery or whatever that can be done. Those are clearly things that are transhumanist in origin. And being able to talk about those things, or when those things do happen, be able to bring up the transhumanist message and play it back to, yes, that's really great, and I'm happy to see that moving into the mainstream, and now let's talk about the next thing and keep moving the conversation forward. And the more we have these kind of conversations, I think the better prepared we are to be able to take advantage of that. I know personally, UBI is part of the Futurist New Deal, and some of the other candidates have UBI considerations. And now we've got somebody on the national stage that is talking UBI, and suddenly this is becoming water cooler conversation. This is some of the things that transhumanism does best, I think, is to keep pushing these ideas forward.
Yes. And I would say in people, if you're ever at a loss as to how to speak to people about transhumanism, and almost everybody in this community maybe has had this kind of response from someone or other, to focus on the life extension, but not as a hard sell, as talking about the emerging biomedicine, talking about the kinds of things like you mentioned, telemedicine, the kinds of things that are interesting to people that already exist in prototype form, that can already be improving as they are increasingly implemented, these good outcomes that can be moving us then all towards a discussion of life extension as a more proven proven undertaking. This is the best way to talk about futurism, in my view. Some people in our community, they like to also have a lot of fun with it, to take it in other directions. But I think that for outreach, really grounding it in near-term realities and emerging technologies that exist in some prototype form is a good first response.
Well, I think it's a way that they can, somebody new to this can latch on to that for something that they can see that's near term, that's not too far out of the normal day-to-day to go, I see that as a possibility. And then from there, perhaps we can take it further, but in smaller steps, taking that near-term reality and then building on that. And then you can always introduce them, go back full circle to where we started. We started with Ray Kurzweil was mentioned early on. And I love talking about some of his things that he predicts going forward. And then I love to pull out the book and say, well, these are the things that he has predicted in the past, and these are the dates when he said that they were about to occur. And you create another type of, gee, that could be possible as well, based on a past track record. Of course, as they say in the financial business, past results are no guarantee of the future, but I'm betting on Ray.
And he had a pretty robust use in those earlier writings of data science and analysis of that. He has an awful lot of data at his disposal now.
Yes, he does.
So I don't imagine that those predictive abilities are going to be becoming a lot worse. They might even be improving as the years go on. So yeah, that's that is a very good way to be framing it as well. And yeah, like I said, Ray Kurzweil was the kind of biggest inspiration for me in becoming a part of this movement, and I think for a lot of people, and having one of his books to refer to, it's not the worst idea.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And Ray Kurzweil was also very instrumental for me too. He spoke via robot at the very first RadFest, and I had found out about the first RadFest and was given a flyer, and Ray Kurzweil was one of the 5 main speakers. And when I did a little research on him, it was very easy to become excited about possibilities. And it's nice that he'll be back at RadFest again this year. And as you say, I don't suspect that any of his predictions will have gone too far away from what they should be. I get excited when a couple of them that I'm following that are very important to me are either re-verified, or in a couple of cases, he's become even more optimistic about him than he was a little bit ago, and that's because he has more data.
Yeah. And so some of the particular benchmarks, some of the particular things yet to be met, is predicted by Ray Kurzweil is 2045, an advanced algorithm speeding up of the abilities and creation of advanced algorithms, effectively recursive AI, recursive self-improving AI. And this is something that is often described as being the sort of first moments of the technological singularity. And there's every reason to suppose that this is a realistic near-term prospect, even if we're off by a few years. I do believe that this is something that we can hope for, and certainly some techno-singularitarian effects we can imagine around that time, whatever those might be. It might not be AI completely eating the world, but in a good way. But we can certainly imagine a lot of things along those lines being occurring. And the other one is 2029.
My favorite.
The Methuselarity, as Jose likes to say, the longevity escape velocity becoming a reality for the peoples of the Earth. And Ray Kurzweil says that for himself in 2020, he believes that he's reached longevity escape velocity. He's no longer aging because he has a sufficient number of interventions to be preventing cell death and degeneration of his physical self. And we can hope that in those 9 remaining years between 2020 and 2029, that will be getting to all of the rest of us in the United States and the world around exciting prospects.
Well, I think so, and we have plenty of history that says that that sort of progression will happen. One that's, I guess, most people like to use is the cell phone. I remember my very first cell phone. It was very big, very clunky, and it did 2 things, and neither one of them very well. It would make a call, and it could receive a message. And I didn't do very much on either because both of them were very, very expensive to do during that time. I was still using a older technology, the pager. Anybody remember the pager?
I do.
And I would give out my pager phone number, my pager number, but not my cell phone number. And when somebody would page me, I would look at that and decide whether it was worth a phone call back because the phone call was so expensive. Well, that all sounds ridiculous today. To anybody that's opted into phones in, say, the last 10 or 20 years, they would look at that as totally, ridiculous.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to see that in other technologies as well. I don't think there's any reason to not see that. So I am very grateful for the early adopters. I'm very grateful for those that are blazing the trail. So if Ray Kurzweil has personally achieved longevity escape velocity for himself, that is just going to make it so much better for the rest of us as time comes on. And I don't think that's an overly optimistic point of view. I think there's just too much data that says that by driving it down to the average person, it not only gets better for us because we have access to it, but for those that can still afford more, there's more available for them. And if we can keep that flowing down, then that keeps opening up the possibilities. Otherwise, the whole thing becomes static. So when somebody says, what's in it for, say, the very rich or the very well-connected to want to share this, there's a lot in it for them, because do you think that they would still want to be going around with the very first cell phone that they had that was available to them? I think not.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting analogy and parallel. This idea that minutes are no longer rationed.
That's right.
They're not a free good, but they're close enough that we're able to use them without any real hesitation. And we can see in that from 2020, when Ray Kurzweil is having effectively reversed cell death at a cost of, for himself, maybe many tens of millions of dollars, we see with each passing month or year it moving closer to that, away from that early cell phone and towards that great moment in history where public health outcomes are radically changed. I do believe that we are moving there. Yeah, it's a touching idea. It is. The longevity escape velocity, it's not merely an academic idea, or it brings to mind talking to Liz Parrish about my mother. My mother's a type 1 diabetic, and she has been for basically her entire life. She became aware of it as a young adult, when she was about 19 years old, and she struggled with it over the years. And she's been, of course, insulin dependent for many years. She's had different iterations of an insulin pump, and even that, is always adjustments and trouble with it. Now this technology is advanced to the point where we are on the verge of having something that's rather like an artificial pancreas for people, and also interventions besides that are more in less of the mechanical kind that would have potentially be having a similar effect. And my mother has always said this to me, as I remember it very distinctly growing up. She says, I hope that someday people that I know and love will be making a contribution to fixing this specific problem. And we see that on the horizon for not just people with these specific concerns, but combating aging in general in the coming decades. And I hope
combating aging and expanding health span. It's not just enough to not get older, but to maintain your health. And we talk about age reversal, but I would love to be healthier this year than I was last year, and to continue that as we move forward. And with what we see on the horizon, things that are being talked about, increasing communications, we've talked about that, we've talked about AI, all of these things play into making radical life extension and radical health expansion even more possible.
Yes. Another gentleman associated with the Humanity Plus organization, well known to many of us, just pinged me moments ago. It's coming up, Didier. He's also a contributor to the Transhumanist Handbook, and just scheduling with him to interview him on his chapter. So it came to mind because I saw his notification there.
Well, I'll be looking forward to that, I'm sure.
Yeah. So many great minds contributing to this work. So many people working together to see the Transhumanist Party advanced, to see transhumanist organizations of other kinds advanced, to see the state of biomedicine advanced, and it's a wonderful. It's been a hell of a ride for me to get to know you, to get to know of all of these guys a little bit more, not just reading B.J. Murphy's articles, but getting to interview B.J. Murphy or
Yes.
participate in a panel discussion. Not just reading David Wood's book, but getting to talk to David Wood. Same thing with all of the people that we mentioned. It's been an incredible experience. And again, I think we should wrap up in the discussion of the Transhumanist Handbook by thanking Newton Lee
Absolutely.
for putting this together and for the great organizing
and
work.
putting the weekend on and bringing those people together. That was tremendous.
Yeah.
Tremendous.
Yeah. The wonderful leader for the California Transhumanist Party, and a wonderful organizer besides in these other areas, and a great researcher in his own right as well. Yes. Well, thank you, folks, for tuning into this special Transhumanist Handbook discussion and companion piece discussion. We're looking forward to more updates as we get more of these surveys of the chapters in the can, so to speak, and we'll be always available and at your service to discuss all of these subjects. So thank you.
Absolutely. Viva la revolution.
Viva la revolution.